since I come from a consulting background, I'm going to talk a little bit about some best practices with change management and emphasize the better part of better change management with BMC FootPrints 12. Change management basics. So let's first kind of define what change management is. I'll assume most of you have heard of change management and are probably doing change management in your IT organizations. Change management can be done in a very formal way, and we're going to talk about how a product like FootPrints can help you with the formality and control and structure, or it can be done in a very informal or haphazard way where you simply have a meeting before you make changes and maybe a meeting afterwards to say, how did the change go? Well, change management is, of course, all about risk reduction. As I say, risk reduction is the name of the game. When we say risk reduction, we're talking about risk in creating some kind of incident. And let me give you an example of this. In a lot of cases, somebody calls your service desk with an incident, and they say, oh, we've got some issue where this software doesn't work or this feature or whatever isn't working, but it worked yesterday. Well, the first thing we think is, what changed? So just the fact that we make changes to things can sometimes break other things, and that's the risk we're trying to avoid. We're trying to keep the services to the customers up and running, and we don't want any downtime. So we have to, if we're careful with the changes we make to production systems, then we can avoid fallout, so to speak, from making those changes. And as a matter of fact, when we say a change, we're talking specifically about a move or a configuration change of moving that change into production. And so just because you make the change in the test environment, well, that doesn't necessarily affect the end users. But once you move that change, whether it's a hardware change or software change, into production, there is risk involved. Gartner Group and Forrester Research and others have actually said that the 80-20 rule applies to this. About 80% of unplanned outages are caused by changes. I think they called it planned outages. So about 80% of unplanned outages or downtime are caused by changes, things that we did as IT organization to put in a patch or a fix or whatever, and we caused an outage. So we want to avoid that, and one great way to do that is to manage the change process. As a matter of fact, I will contend that the change management process, which is one of the 20 or so ITIL processes, it may be the most important process, more so than maybe even incident management or service request. Because if we can manage the changes in a very effective manner, we'll reduce a lot of the outages or downtime for the customers. If you're cutting out a lot of those outages, you're going to have a lot less incidents at the service desk. And then most of the other processes, and I'm talking about ITIL processes, might spawn a change. And by the way, we call a change, the technical term is a request for change, or RFC, request for change. So other processes that might spawn changes include things like maybe release management or problem management, certainly incident management, and service requests, which is also known as request fulfillment process. And then the change management process is kind of tied at the hip to something called the CMDB, the Configuration Management Database. The reason the CMDB and change management are so closely aligned is because change management, before you make a change, you need to know what is the state or status of the item. We call it a CI, configuration item. What is the status of that item before the change, and what is the status of that item after the change? Well, those are things that we record in a database called a CMDB, or Configuration Management Database. And as a matter of fact, if you're running your processes through a tool like FootPrints, then you can have change management, the updates, when something's actually moved into production, make the update to the CMDB item, in this case the CI, the configuration item. Well, let's talk a little bit about some best practices, ways that you can make your change management process better, since that's in the title. And one way to do that is to keep the process simple. And I usually call this KISS, I guess with an extra S, keep it simple, silly, we'll say. Then you can, if you do keep this simple, then creating and designing a change management process or system can be easier to design, number one, and easier to maintain. And there's a couple key items. I've listed 7 key items that you can use to help keep your change management process simple. One is to only track moves that are moves into production, not development projects. But by development projects, I'm talking about things that need programming, for example, so a software development effort. So rather than putting in something, an RFC, request for change, when we're ready to start development on something, or if we're early on in the testing process of a new version or something, we'll do that in another process like release management. Reserve change management for when you're now ready to move this CI, this item, into production. That will help simplify your process. Now, that isn't necessarily true ITIL, but it does simplify the process, and it works very well for small, medium businesses and like I said, some government agencies as well. Number 2, what constitutes a change? Well, this is one of the most important items that somebody has to come up with when they're designing their change management system. Are they going to, at what point do you need an RFC? What constitutes a change? Are we going to say that every single update to a server needs an RFC? Well, probably yes. What about every single change or update to a laptop or a desktop? Well, it depends. And so if you're going to say you're going to track changes at the desktop level, then you're going to have a lot more changes to track. And we can talk about the different types of changes in a minute, but a lot of those desktop changes might be low risk, so they might be standard or routine changes. But number 2, again, we're talking about what constitutes a change, and that needs to be clearly defined. What you don't want to happen is people in IT, they make a change and it breaks something, and you say, well, you didn't, this wasn't scrutinized because there's no RFC. It didn't go through the change management process. And they go, well, I didn't realize I needed an RFC for this. So you want to avoid that if possible. So you need to clearly define what constitutes a change. And again, in a perfect world, everything that you change, anything that's configurable, should have a change record or an RFC. I also, number 3, call this an internal process. By internal, I'm talking about internal to IT, information technology. So what I try to do is avoid doing the change or the vetting of the change. And when I say vetting, we're trying to reduce risk, right? So what we want to do is vet the change so that we make sure that it doesn't affect anything else. So that vetting of the change is something that IT folks are qualified to do, not the end users, not the customers. So I try to keep this as just an internal IT process, and I keep the customers out. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, you got to include the customers. They need to know about this. They probably need to approve it. They probably own the process, the business process owners, and you would be absolutely correct. However, once the customer has requested something that may require a change, and once they've approved it, and I would do that in the service desk, by the way, that's where we handle customer issues, then it's up to us, once we start to move this into production, to vet the change. In other words, we're the IT experts. We should know, is this change going to affect something else. So let me give you an example where we're going to make a change to a database. And DBA said, okay, well, we know what we're doing, so, but we'll go ahead and put in this RFC anyway. And then the application or development group that uses the database, they look at it and say, well, if you're going to make those changes to the schema, then we're going to have to make changes to the application. So, this isn't as simple as you thought. This would have broke the application. And then maybe the systems administration group says, well, wait a minute, the server that the database sits on is going to be down. We're going to be upgrading the server. And the network group says, well, wait a minute, we were going to be rerouting routers at that same change window. You won't be able to get to anything anyway through the network. So these are the kinds of things that you want scrutinized or vetted by IT. And that's exactly why we have, in the next bullet, number 4, something known as a CAB. CAB, of course, stands for Change Advisory Board. It is an ITIL term. And again, in keeping with this as an internal process, and if you want to keep this simple, then you would keep the CAB with IT organizations representing each IT organization rather than customers. The customers have already signed off. They want this, they require this, and they maybe have given you target times when and dates when it's good to do this. So that's why I'm saying the sign-off on requests, in other words, the customer requests, are done over in the service desk rather than in the change management process. So if you can keep the CAB, keep the customers out of the CAB, even though ITIL kind of states that, it can simplify the process. And here we're talking about how to simplify it. Number 5, limit yourself to only 3 types of changes. This comes right out of the ITIL playbook. The 3 types of changes are emergency changes, and we have those, things that have to be done in a quick manner. We don't have time to test it. We don't have time to scrutinize it by a CAB. We need to do something now to bring a system back up. And so we do have, unfortunately, emergency changes. And because it's an emergency and we don't vet the change very well, it is high risk. So somebody high enough up the IT food chain, high enough in the organization, they bet their career on the fact that they'll take the risk. So somebody needs to accept the risk that they can put in an emergency change, because guess what? It's going to be risky. The second type of change is, of course, a normal change, and those go through a CAB. And then the third type of change, ITIL calls it a standard change. Of course, standard sounds like normal to most of us Americans. So, but what they mean is a routine change, things that are done all the time. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Desktop and laptop type changes, they only affect one person, and they're probably things we do all the time. Those are probably going to be routine changes for the most part. And so a routine change, because we do it all the time, and it's probably not affecting a lot of people, those will be low risk. Some people refer to those as pre-approved changes, although I don't necessarily go down the path that they are completely pre-approved. I like some kind of manager approval generally. So back to number 5. So we're limiting to just 3 types of change types right out of the ITIL manual. No gray areas. But when I say no gray areas, I mean, don't give in and say, well, we need some changes that are normal changes. We'll go through a CAB, but it needs to be rushed through. Well, if it's going to be rushed through, you're introducing more risk. So I would be careful with that, and I would shy away from any gray areas, which is another change type between emergency and normal. And then that brings us down to number 7. You still need to document the testing phase. Even though I said we're only going to track things that they move into production, there's a number of things on your RFC that need to be documented, and that's that it has been tested, and then we'll see later that there's things like backout plans and so forth that need to be put into an RFC.